Hi, I'm Nyesha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Welcome to the Grassroots Business Journal, where small business is linked to social media. I am your host, Paul Wilusz, and today as my guest, I have State Representative Edwin Vargs from the 6th District here in Connecticut. Pleasure to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here, Paul.
Excellent, Edwin. I know it's been, over the last month or so, it's been very busy at the state capitol. And it's a busy agenda. What do you see as maybe the top 2 or 3 items that the legislature is going to handle, and if it's going to be working in some kind of way to help small business?
Well, I believe there's several things that are happening. Some of them have been ongoing the last few years to help small business. One has been the Business Express, which is a program that is a combination of low interest loans to small business together with some grants for business. So it's been a very successful program. Some businesses have gotten huge amounts of cash.
Okay.
To expand their businesses, to grow their businesses. So I think the Business Express has been one of the bright spots. It came out of the Commerce Committee, which I have a pleasure of serving on.
Now, is that statewide, or is it within the cities?
No, it's a statewide program, okay. And it's benefited companies from every end of the state, every corner of the state is benefited by it. Some people have criticized it. They said, why is the state infusing so much money into business? But I think it's been part of the key of why we've been able to keep many of our companies and grow many of our companies here in Connecticut. Of course, you got successful operations like ESPN in Bristol. Mm-hmm. ESPN has grown incredibly. It started as a small operation, mm-hmm. and the state has partnered with it, and now ESPN has grown into one of the major employers in the state. Okay. And also very attractive in terms of giving life to other businesses from spin-off business, and also attractive in terms of giving the state some cachet of being a sports mecca for the media. And that's one program. Another program that was developed by the Commerce Committee. By the way, I serve on Commerce, on the Children's Committee, which deals with all aspects of the child, separate from the Education Committee. So we deal with health issues, preschool issues, okay. Primary care issues, things like daycare, licensing, and issues like that. We work with DCF. So I have the Children's Committee, the Commerce Committee, and I also serve on the Appropriations Committee, which is the committee that decides how much to allocate to different state agencies and programs. Now, that works together in tandem with another committee called the Finance Committee, where our state senator for the south end of Hartford and Wethersfield, John Fonfara, is the Senate co-chair. Okay. And that is the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. They raise the money, and Appropriations allocates the money. Okay. So those two committees work in tandem. In terms of support for the business community, one of the issues that we've worked on the Commerce Committee is the Step Up program. Okay. Step Up program is separate from the Business Express program. The Step Up program is a program that provides funding for job training. So employers that would like to hire additional staff but need to train the staff and don't have the finances or funding to be able to train new staff can apply to the Step Up program. Step Up program will allocate money for job training for new employees, which has also helped many small businesses that were expanding in training their workforce, and it's absorbed part of that overhead cost, which has helped the business.
So who is actually doing the training part part of that? Is that from independent contractors for trainers?
The employer decides that.
Okay.
The employer can do in-house training. The employer can hire consultants. The employer can hire a company that specializes in training in because every field is different. Training in every field is different. So the state is not involved in that aspect. We're just involved in the aspect of funding the training to keep the business overhead low.
Do you see a lot of involvement or interest within that?
Well, we allocated millions of dollars to these programs, and the money went flying out the window quickly. So we're looking for larger allocations. So these programs are being utilized by the business community.
Okay.
So
good.
this year we're looking to raise the allocation to these programs. So the Commerce Committee, which is chaired in the case of the House, the co-chair is Representative Perrone. The Senate co-chair is Senator Gary LeBeau from East Hartford, who's a friend of mine, former teacher, colleague of mine in the public school systems. And they co-chair the committee. It's been a very successful committee. And I'm glad I'm involved. I was able in the last session to help the people involved in the defense industry, especially the International Association of Machinists and others that are concerned about jobs. Machinists, tool and die makers, and those kinds of jobs that are important jobs to the economy and manufacturing. They were looking to have the Commerce Committee authorize a study on conversion of our manufacturing to peacetime manufacturing once defense contracts dry up.
Okay.
And as it turns out, I was able to play a role in that in the Commerce Committee to help shepherd that legislation through, that conversion legislation.
Is this the first time that such legislation has come up? I know that there was talk and discussion back years where you had when the Vietnam War was happening and coming into a peacetime situation. But is this something that's new in talking peacetime conversions? And is it a serious one that they're actually looking at?
Well, the idea is not new. The idea of economic conversion to peacetime manufacturing from defense manufacturing. But as you know, the defense industry has been hanging on as much as it can, partly because of what happened with the Twin Towers and the whole war on terrorism and our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are now winding down. We're going to be leaving Afghanistan soon. We're already out of Iraq. So the fact is that the idea has been bounced around, but there's been resistance to passing a law that would establish such a study group because, on the one hand, you have people that still hope that they can continue the levels of defense manufacturing that we've had in the past, but I think that's unrealistic.
Okay.
And then the second opposition is from people who believe that manufacturing is a backward kind of industry and that's best left to developing nations like China and India. But I believe that there is room for manufacturing in Connecticut and that we need to grow manufacturing in Connecticut. We have a long history with manufacturing going back to being the first industrial city in the United States with Sam Colt and the Colt's Firearms Company. So it may not be manufacturing at the scale that we had in the 1950s, but there are certainly some niche industries where we need specialized machinists and others, and I believe that it's a sector that we can't write off. So I'm fighting to keep manufacturing, and the fact is we did pass the bill, and the study group was created. The governor signed the bill, so we will have a task force working on economic conversion, and I'm sure that the recommendations coming out of that task force will probably translate into specific bills later on.
You've been involved with education for a long time.
I have.
Is the current structure within education within the city of Hartford and the surrounding areas, are they prepared to take on the new workforce for the 21st century as far as for our young people to really look forward to?
Well, education Education is and it's an interesting subject because, as you know, I've been a leader on this issue. I was president of the Hartford Federation of Teachers. I was a chief negotiator for some of the contracts between the school board, unions, and the city of Hartford. I was also involved on public policy issues, lobbying at the state capitol for funding for public education, working with the formulas, different formulas for funding. And I believe that we have a problem in the inner cities, and we have an educational gap, which is an embarrassment to the state of Connecticut. And the educational gap has been intractable. I mean, people are saying that we've been trying to address this issue, but in reality, I believe we've missed a mark by a country mile, because if you look at the populations that are the cause of the gap, the primary cause of the gap is poverty. There's a huge gap between middle-class suburban white students and inner-city poor minority students. This gap, largely it's based on poverty, but also there's other aggravating factors, special education students that need extra help because they face different challenges, students that have limited English. So those are the populations that we need to address if we want to close the gap, and those populations tend to be concentrated in the neighborhood public schools. Okay. Now, back in the 1890s, I supported the whole reform movement, see if we could reform the system, because what we were doing, obviously wasn't meeting the needs of some large portion of those inner city kids. So I supported one of the first charter schools, Sports and Medical Science Academy. I supported a program by Dr. Norman Newman Johnson called Project Breakthrough, and others as experiments to see if we could learn some lessons from these charter schools that could be applied to the neighborhood public schools. And unfortunately, that was in the 1890s. We're in 2014 now. And
1990?
This was in the 1990s when we started these charter schools, right. But now we're in 2014, many years later, and there's a proliferation of charter schools and very little reinvestment in the neighborhood public schools. So rather than serving as models, as urban laboratories that were going to show being demonstration schools that would teach us things that we could apply to the schools, they become an industry unto themselves. So I have a bill this year that would create a 3-year moratorium of no more charter schools, and take the whatever money has been destined over the next 3 years for the charter school, for new charter schools, to be reinvested into the pilot program, the payment in lieu of taxes to the cities. Because, as you know, part of the problem, and it affects the business community, is the high tax rates, high property tax rates in the city. So, and the backward way which Connecticut uses to fund education, based on property taxes, which is not a very egalitarian way to fund public education, which is supposed to be the bulwark of democracy.
That's right. That's right. So, with that in mind, where do you see, very quickly, the future of the current academies and the charter schools moving forward? Where do you really see that in the future?
Well, you see, here's part of the problem. Part of the problem is studies that have been done have shown that there's very little difference between a public school that's dealing with middle class, white kids, and the charter schools. They haven't really shown anything. All they've shown is something we could have spared ourselves hundreds of millions of dollars. They've shown that if you organize a school for white middle class kids, you're going to succeed, especially if it's a school organized for kids that are high achievers, that have parents that are very involved in their kids' education. There's no mystery there. The idea behind charter schools, by the way, the same idea behind CREC, the Capital Region Educational Council, which is supposed to be a regional board of education, which was supposed to create programs for the special needs students. So that, let's say, Hartford had 8 autistic kids, West Hartford had 2, East Hartford had 3. They were supposed to bring together those students at a regional level and create a quality program for special needs kids. Well, CREC has moved away from that mission, because CREC probably at some point decided it was very difficult to succeed with that student population. So several years ago, they went after our Montessori school, which was a Hartford public school program that was very successful. We had a lot of parents who believed in the Montessori model. They were housed at the Learning Corridor on Washington and Vernon Street. It was very active. They actually started in the north end of Hartford. And CREC lobbied and convinced the State Department of Education to house that program within CREC. And so we started losing the high achieving programs to CREC. And CREC basically has been doing the same thing that some of our charter schools have been doing and some of the magnet schools have been doing. Magnet schools are different. Magnet schools were created to help integrate on a racial level the region, break up a little bit of the racial isolation because of the fact that most of the enrollment in the inner cities was minority enrollment, and most of the suburban enrollment was white enrollment.
Okay.
And a lot of it came out of the chef case.
We'll keep our point at this point. We'll stop at this point, and we'll pick that up in our next segment. Welcome back to the Grassroots Business Journal. I am your host, Paul Wilusz. We're talking here today with Edwin Vargs, 6th District State Representative. Glad to have you.
Pleasure.
We've been talking a little bit on some issues regarding a little bit of some small business, but we also started to talk a little bit in regards to the educational situation here, and talking about how we see the future of the current charter schools and how that is going to be looking and shaping up our young people to for the workforce, basically. Expand a little bit on that, if you can. Is the programs working? Do they need to be readjusted? And what's it going to really take?
Well, the few schools that have really dealt with poor populations, a few charter schools that have really addressed the issue of poverty, like the Harlem School in New York City, which worked with poor kids, what it showed was that if you provide poor kids with wraparound services and meet their other needs, not necessarily educational needs, that these kids' performance will improve dramatically. So, for example, there was a documentary recently about the Harlem School, which I was watching, and the principal was talking about one of the students and said, well, what was the problem at their old neighborhood school? So, well, the kid missed over half of the classes at the old neighborhood school. Here, he has almost 100% attendance. So we found out that the kid, didn't have transportation. So here at the Harlem School, we provided the kid with reliable transportation. And what was the problem with this girl? Well, the problem with her was, she was falling asleep at 10 a.m. at the old neighborhood school. And we found out she wasn't really getting a breakfast, so to keep her energy up. So over here we provided a breakfast program for girls like her and boys like her that need nutritional issues. So basically, what the principal demonstrated was that they had broken down all the different needs. There were obstacles to the kids being able to utilize the education opportunity to its fullest, and they addressed those barriers. They addressed those barriers with resources.
So in other words, they just didn't talk about them, say this is what it is. They came out with solutions.
That's correct. And so there's no reason where our neighborhood schools can't provide the same wraparound services.
Okay.
Well, we can't make that kind of an investment in our schools. It requires several things. One, it requires that our schools be smaller, so that people really get to know the students and what issues each student is facing. You have to have an inventory of each, because each child is an individual. And what may be a barrier to one kid's education is not necessarily what's causing problems for another kid. Each kid may have different issues. And so you have to find out, is it a problem that the kid was exposed to lead? Do they have neurological problems? Is the kid hard of hearing? Or is he deaf? Does the kid have dyslexia? Does the kid have attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity? What is the actual problem and challenges that this particular child is facing? So in a smaller school, with a smaller enrollment, it's easier for the staff to get to know the children on a more personal level.
Do you see leadership being an obstacle?
Well, I believe many of our corporations and many of our business leaders tend to gravitate toward these new models, like charter school models. They tend to support them. It's the new sexy thing. Somebody comes up with an idea, we're going to create the aerospace school of the future, the Mars project school, the Socratic method school, where we're going to use Socrates' philosophy. Somebody comes up with an idea, and it sounds good. And they establish a school, and they seem to get a lot of corporate sponsorship. They seem to get a lot of media attention and a lot of supports. It's not as sexy to support your neighborhood public school. It's not as attractive, and there's not as much publicity involved for corporate sponsors and just supporting the day in and day out education of poor kids in an inner city school. So we've got to change the mindset. Well, another bill that I have, besides the bill we were discussing about earlier, which would be a moratorium on charter schools, on new charter schools. I'm not talking about going after old established charter schools, but just a moratorium on new charter schools, and investing money into the pilot program so we can help the neighborhood schools and we can help the mill rates in towns like Hartford, where the mill rate is incredibly high. We're in the 70s, which is the highest in the state of Connecticut. It's very difficult, and especially since state law mandates that we transition some of that corporate tax and business tax toward the residential tax. As that starts to happen, people who are homeowners or people who own buildings will start passing the cost on to their renters, and people are going to be hurting. It has to be done because, frankly, the business community has been paying more than their fair share because of a differential that was established years ago in the city of Hartford. It's the only city with disparate mill rates for business and residential. But now any attempt to resolve that is going to put an extra burden on the residential property owners unless we can increase that pilot program so it can absorb part of that cost, so that those increments can be kept at either zero or hopefully even reduce the mill rate a bit. So that would be the ideal. The other bill I was going to tell you about is another bill I have, which is that no neighborhood school. This bill I introduced as a concept, and I'm waiting for them to write up the language. But basically the concept I introduced for this bill is that no neighborhood public school should get less than our magnet schools. We've been very generous with the magnet schools because we're trying to integrate the region. And we know that it's very difficult to do it through housing patterns because people are very defensive of their planning and zoning and their housing requirements in the suburbs. So we've tried to do it through the magnet school. Very generous support for the magnet schools. Well, I believe that whatever we give the magnet schools should be the baseline support for our neighborhood schools, because most of the kids stuck in the neighborhood school are not going to be able to go either to a charter school or to a magnet school or to a private school. And in a sense, charter schools are private schools.
That's right.
And we are using public money that should be going to public education to fund these charter schools. Now, magnet schools are public school. They're state-sponsored public schools. And like I said, the state has been very generous, and there's been the This is part of the solution to address the Chef O'Neill lawsuit, which I support. You know, the fact that kids have been suffering from racial isolation, and we need to address that. So I'm not talking about taking anything away from the magnet schools. Whatever funding level the magnet schools have, they should remain at that level. What I'm talking about is making that level the baseline for our neighborhood schools.
Do you see, well, where do you see small business in the city of Hartford? Let's say the cities themselves. Is there a place for small businesses and growth of small businesses in the inner cities?
Well, I think a bright spot may turn out to be downtown if those new buildings that are going to provide more housing units come online, and if they're able to attract the population they're trying to attract, which is empty nesters, single individuals, young urban professionals. If they're able to grow the housing in downtown, that'll create the opportunity for retail, which is something that downtown Hartford has been missing for a long time. We lost a laundry there. We lost a small supermarket there. It's very difficult if you don't have feet on the ground in the neighborhood. And, you know, downtown was a neighborhood at one time, but during urban development in the 60s, it was turned into basically an urban park. And as soon as people left their place of employment, the place became a ghost town. So the XL Center brings in some revenue for small retail when there's a game in town, but it's not a reliable stream of revenue. If you had a population that was living 24/7 in downtown, it would help. That's what's made Boston such a vital city. You see the storefronts, but on the second and third, fourth floor, there's tenements of people living above that retail space.
Okay. Enterprise zones. Success, or just a project that's still there?
Well, the enterprise zones was something that State Senator Wilbur Smith, the late State Senator Wilbur Smith, who was a good friend of mine, and myself, we pursued that years ago. I'm talking back in the 1970s, we pushed the idea of enterprise zones. And I believe enterprise zones have had a mixed record. They have provided an opportunity for some distressed areas. They have brought in some investment in some areas. How successful enterprise zones are depends how attractive they can be made for investment. And that requires a collaboration from the city, from the state. They have to really partner in making sure that they're providing the incentives for business. It can't be temporary, it can't be partial, it can't be half-hearted. If you're going to create an enterprise zone, you have to do it with the intent to succeed.
So has the enterprise zones been taking a back seat to other areas and other concerns?
Yes, I believe that enterprise zones haven't traditionally received the kind of support that they would really need to consistently attract business and make it possible for someone to invest in them. Because remember, you're also asking people to take on an area which is either a high crime area or an area that has been polluted or an area that is isolated. So you're asking the investor to take a risk. So the incentives have to, when they do their cost-benefit analysis, have to be proved that they're in the black. Otherwise, you're not going to get investment.
Okay. If you were to give advice to a small business owner today, from your understanding, for a young entrepreneur, what would you give them?
Well, I believe there's plenty of opportunity in the cities. And I believe that if you look at, for example, companies that are well-heeled, like the franchise outfits, they have no problem succeeding in the city because they know there's plenty of people, but they have the backing, the corporate backing, to be able to have the sustainability through good times and through hard times. So when you look at the large operations like the McDonald's, the Burger Kings, Walmart, Stop and Shop, they're all doing well. in the city of Hartford. And it's the small business person, the small entrepreneur that comes in, usually has credit issues, usually doesn't have sufficient capital to back them up for a period of time while they build up a client base. So there are challenges there. That's what we're trying to address with programs like the Business Express and the Step Up program. Those are the issues that Governor Malloy and the Democrats at the Capitol are trying to address through programs like that to make it better for those entrepreneurs. Now, the city of Hartford, I believe, can go through a renaissance if we're successful in developing affordable housing and increasing our population here in the city of Hartford. There will be a basis for more business. And it also has a daytime population that grows quite large from people from the suburbs who come. It's still a hub of employment. So there are opportunities here. But here's the other advantage these franchises have. They do studies. How much foot traffic goes by a certain street, how much vehicular traffic goes through a street, what the income level of a certain neighborhood is, what the disposable cash. They have all these studies. So by the time they open a business, it's almost like 99.9% sure that they're going to succeed.
Okay.
So the small entrepreneur has to go on a hunch. Usually doesn't have the kind of capital to back them on doing those kinds of feasibility studies. They're very expensive. It's a very specialized industry that does that kind of work. So you're basically operating on your own experience and your own wits. And so your chances of success are much lower than those franchises.
I know our time is just about up over here. I just wanted to give a quick little wrap up. Minimum wage, how does that affect the worker and also the small business?
Well, you see, I think it's part of a dialogue we need to have with corporate America. I'm a strong supporter of the small business community, and I support medium-sized businesses and businesses that are, even large businesses that are in heavily competitive areas. But we also have many areas where we have either a monopoly or a duopoly or a triopoly, where one or two big businesses dominate. And I'm against corporate monopolies. I believe that they're a stranglehold on the consumer, and they dictate to the market rather than having, we talk about the classic, economics where the market dictates to capitalism. But when you have such control that some of these corporate monopolies have, it distorts the economic picture and sometimes puts a small business guy out of business. So my own feeling on this is that we need to foster business, but we also need to make sure that these large corporations that support the middle class. And I think raising the minimum wage is part of that strategy, which is, I was involved with the fast food workers on a struggle to bring up their salaries to $15 an hour. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people say $15 an hour for McDonald's, Burger King, Dunkin' Donuts, that's a lot of money. In reality, it isn't. $15 an hour translates to about $400 a week. I mean, it's still just to barely survive on that. If you look at what minimum wage was in the 1940s and 50s and you compare it to what it is today and adjust it for the rate of inflation, people working for minimum wage have lost. Mm-hmm. So I believe if we have a strong consumer base and we built our middle class, we'd get millions of people out of poverty that are just hovering around the poverty line.
Okay.
And that would affect 2 or 3 other people that rely on those people, especially children. So we would lift a lot of people out of poverty and give people more disposable income, which I think in the long run will help business. There's one of the differences between a wealthy Democrat and a wealthy Republican, and I'll be a little partisan on this, is that the wealthy Democrat believes that you have to pay into the system to keep the system going. Wealthy Republicans believe they can corner, every penny. But that's a failing strategy in the long run.
Okay. We have a lot to talk about. Would love to have you back again. My guest has been Edwin Vargs, 6th District Representative for the state of Connecticut. Appreciate having you on the
Thank
show.
you, Paul.
We'll have you again. Keep talking business. I'm your host, Paul Wilusz. See you again.